If you are over the age of 65, and you have recently found yourself staring blankly into an open refrigerator, entirely unable to remember what you were looking for, or if you have panicked because a familiar name suddenly vanished from your mind during a conversation, you are likely terrified that the inevitable shadow of Alzheimer's disease has finally found you. This fear is paralyzing, accompanied by the absolute highest stakes imaginable, the potential loss of your independence, the fading of your most precious lifetime memories, and the ultimate surrender of your physical and mental sovereignty to an unforgiving disease. But you must listen to me very carefully right now. The memory slips, the sudden brain fog, and the terrifying moments of disorientation that you are experiencing might not be Alzheimer's disease at all. There is a silent imposter that has fooled the medical establishment for decades, a completely different biological condition that mimics the symptoms of Alzheimer's with terrifying accuracy, yet requires an entirely different approach to halt and even reverse. Today we are going to expose this imposter, and I promise you that by the time we finish, you will have the exact scientifically validated tools to protect your brain, reclaim your cognitive clarity, and ensure that your golden years are lived on your own terms. For years, whenever an older adult walked into a clinic complaining of memory loss, the medical system operated on a rigid, almost dogmatic assumption. The doctor would administer a standard 10-minute cognitive test, observe the mild confusion, and tragically, almost reflexively, write the word Alzheimer's on the patient's chart. You have been conditioned to believe that cognitive decline is either a tragic roll of the genetic dice, or perhaps a personal failure on your part for not doing enough crossword puzzles or learning a second language. I am here to tell you that this is not your fault. The guilt and the shame you may feel about your changing memory are the result of a colossal failure in modern medical communication and deeply flawed, outdated diagnostic guidelines. For over a century, the entire pharmaceutical industry and the global neurological community have been obsessed with a single villain, a sticky substance in the brain called amyloid plaque. They built an entire empire on the belief that if they could just scrub this amyloid plaque out of the brain, Alzheimer's would be cured. Billions of dollars were poured into experimental drugs, and time again, these drugs failed spectacularly in clinical trials. They failed because they were targeting the wrong enemy in millions of patients. It was only very recently, through painstaking research conducted at institutions like the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center in Chicago, that neurologists analyzing the brains of thousands of seniors discovered something that sent shockwaves through the medical community. They found that up to 1/3 of all patients who had been clinically diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, who had lived their final years in memory care units being treated for Alzheimer's, actually had virtually no amyloid plaques in their brains at all. They did not have Alzheimer's disease. They were victims of a massive systemic misdiagnosis. What these researchers discovered instead was a completely different microscopic culprit, a rogue protein that had quietly hijacked the brain's memory centers. This revelation has fundamentally changed our understanding of geriatric brain health, and it introduces us to a condition that the medical community has recently named LATE. LATE is an acronym that stands for Limbic Predominant Age-Related TDP-43 Encephalopathy. I know that sounds like an overwhelming string of medical jargon, but we are going to break it down together, because understanding this condition is the key to your cognitive salvation. Let us start with the first word, limbic. Deep inside your brain, beneath the folded outer layers of the cortex, lies an ancient, deeply protected structure called the limbic system. You can think of the limbic system as the grand central station of your human experience. It is the emotional and memory switchboard of your mind. Within this limbic system sits a tiny, seahorse-shaped organ called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is absolutely vital. It is the printing press for your memories. Every time you meet a new grandchild, every time you learn a new route to the grocery store, and every time you read a fascinating book, your hippocampus is responsible for taking that short-term experience and permanently stamping it into your long-term memory vault. In classic Alzheimer's disease, toxic amyloid plaques spread throughout the entire brain, suffocating cells globally. But LATE is an entirely different beast. LATE is a hyper-focused surgical strike specifically targeting that emotional and memory switchboard, the limbic system. This is precisely why LATE is the ultimate imposter. Because it attacks the exact same memory-forming structures as Alzheimer's, the outward symptoms look perfectly identical to your doctor. You experience the same devastating short-term memory loss, the same struggle to find the right words, and the same frustrating disorientation, but underneath the surface, the biological machinery breaking down is completely different. And this brings us to the villain of our story, the mysterious protein known as TDP-43. To truly understand how this imposter operates, we must paint a picture of what is happening inside your brain cells right now. Imagine a single brain cell, a neuron, as a massive, bustling manufacturing plant. At the very center of this plant is the executive office, which we call the nucleus. Inside this executive office sits the master architect of the cell, a highly specialized protein named TDP-43. When you are healthy, TDP-43 is a diligent, hard-working executive. Its job is to read your DNA blueprints and ensure that the factory is producing all the necessary materials to keep your brain functioning, communicating, and thriving. It never leaves the executive office. It stays precisely where it belongs, doing its vital work. But as we age, and as our bodies are subjected to decades of hidden systemic stress, something terrible happens to this master architect. The protein begins to physically warp. It misfolds, changing its shape entirely. And once it misfolds, TDP-43 abandons its post. It breaks out of the protective executive office of the nucleus and escapes onto the main factory floor, a fluid area called the cytoplasm. Out on the factory floor, this warped protein becomes a menace. It begins to clump together with other broken proteins, forming massive toxic roadblocks. Suddenly, the cell's manufacturing lines are jammed. The brain cell can no longer produce the chemicals it needs to communicate with its neighbors. The factory slowly powers down, the lights go out, and the neuron ultimately perishes. When this happens millions of times over within your hippocampus, your memory begins to fade. That is late. It is not a sticky plaque suffocating the cell from the outside. It is an internal collapse caused by an executive protein abandoning its post. Now you might be asking yourself, why does this happen? Why does a perfectly healthy protein suddenly misfold and destroy the very brain it was designed to protect? This is where we must lift the burden of guilt from your shoulders. For the last 40 years, you have been trying to follow the rules. You adhered to the dietary guidelines handed down by government agencies. You swapped out natural fats for highly processed industrial seed oils because you were told it was better for your heart. You consumed diets heavily reliant on refined carbohydrates because the food pyramid told you that grains should be the foundation of your meals. What the medical establishment failed to understand, and what they are only now beginning to admit, is that this modern Western diet is biologically incompatible with the human brain. We have inadvertently created an environment of chronic, simmering inflammation within our bodies. Every time you consume highly refined sugars or oxidized vegetable oils, you are sending a wave of inflammatory distress signals through your bloodstream. For a time, your brain is protected by a magical physiological wall called the blood-brain barrier, a microscopic security system that allows nutrients in and keeps toxins out. But decades of this relentless, diet-induced inflammation slowly erodes the integrity of that barrier. It becomes leaky, and when systemic inflammation breaches the fortress of the brain, it creates a chaotic, hostile environment inside your neurons. This state of neuroinflammation acts as the exact biological trigger that causes the TDP-43 protein to panic, misfold, and abandon its post in the nucleus. You are not losing your memory because you are simply getting old. You are losing your memory because the modern environment has set your brain on fire, and the smoke from that fire is confusing the internal machinery of your most precious cells. This brings us to a deeply tragic reality of the modern medical system, a reality that explains why so many families watch their loved ones decline despite receiving the best medical care. Because late is constantly misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's, millions of seniors are prescribed powerful brain-altering medications, such as cholinesterase inhibitors, designed specifically to treat Alzheimer's disease. But remember, the biological mechanics of late are entirely different. Giving an Alzheimer's drug to a patient with late is like bringing a fire extinguisher to a flood. Not only does the medication completely fail to halt the progression of the memory loss, but it floods the patient's vulnerable brain with synthetic chemicals that cause agonizing side effects, severe nausea, chronic insomnia, muscle cramping, and dangerous drops in heart rate. Patients are subjected to chemical interventions that offer absolutely zero benefit, while the true underlying cause of their decline, the neuroinflammation triggering the TDP-43 protein, is completely ignored by their physician. But there is profound hope woven into this science. The discovery of late, and the understanding of how neuroinflammation drives it, means that your cognitive destiny is not etched in stone. Unlike the rigid, irreversible plaques of Alzheimer's disease, the inflammatory triggers of late offer us a massive window of opportunity for intervention. We can change the environment of the brain. We can put out the fire. We can coax the TDP-43 protein back into the nucleus and restore the manufacturing lines of your memory centers. And the most beautiful part of this intervention is that it does not require toxic pharmaceuticals, expensive medical procedures, or exhausting regimens that ignore the physical realities of an aging body. To rebuild the fortress of your mind, we must orchestrate a gentle, highly targeted biological rescue. The very first step in this protocol is to drastically alter the chemical signals reaching your brain through your digestive tract. We must extinguish the neuroinflammatory fire at its source. This does not mean adopting a miserable, restrictive starvation diet. Rather, it means flooding your system with the specific, potent molecules that nature designed to repair the blood-brain barrier. We must turn our attention to the profound healing power of omega-3 fatty acids, specifically one known as DHA. DHA is not merely a supplement, it is the literal architectural building block of your brain cells. Over 60% of your brain is made of fat, and a massive portion of that is DHA. When you consume high-quality, wild-caught fatty fish, or a deeply purified algal oil, you are providing your neurons with the exact raw materials they need to rebuild their cellular walls. Imagine your brain cells as houses that have been battered by a hurricane of inflammation. DHA is the fresh lumber and the heavy-duty mortar required to patch the holes and reinforce the structure. As these cellular walls are repaired, the hostile inflammatory environment inside the cell begins to calm down, signaling to the TDP-43 protein that the crisis has passed. But structural repair is only half of the nutritional equation. We must also deploy nature's most powerful antioxidants to clean up the microscopic debris left behind on the factory floor. This is where the magic of polyphenols comes into play. Polyphenols are the dense, deeply colored chemical compounds found in the skins of dark berries, in extra virgin olive oil, and in the leaves of green tea. When you consume these ancient compounds, they perform a miraculous feat. They successfully cross the blood-brain barrier and act as microscopic street sweepers. They neutralize the free radicals that are damaging your neurons, but more importantly, they trigger your brain to release a miraculous protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. You can think of BDNF as high-grade biological miracle-grow for your hippocampus. When your brain is bathed in BDNF, it does something that medical science used to believe was impossible in older adults. It grows new brain cells. It stimulates neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to forge new connections, route around damaged areas, and physically rebuild the memory networks that late has attempted to destroy. By simply incorporating a handful of wild blueberries and a generous pour of authentic olive oil into your daily routine, you are turning on a genetic switch that commands your brain to heal itself. Beyond the profound impact of nutrition, we must address the mechanical lifeblood of your cognitive health: oxygenation and movement. Now, I understand that the word exercise can be deeply intimidating, especially if you are managing the realities of aging joints, arthritis, or chronic back pain. The fitness industry has done a terrible disservice to seniors by promoting the idea that movement must be agonizing, high-impact, and sweat-drenched to be effective. Let me absolutely absolve you of that misconception right now. Your brain does not care if you are running a marathon or sitting in a chair. Your brain only cares about blood flow. When you move your body, even in the gentlest of ways, you increase your heart rate, which pumps a fresh, rich supply of oxygen and nutrients directly into the tiny capillaries of your hippocampus. This rush of blood acts as a pressure wash for your brain cells, clearing away stagnation and delivering the life-giving oxygen required to keep the cellular factories running. If your knees cannot tolerate walking on pavement, that is perfectly fine. You can achieve massive cognitive benefits through completely low-impact modifications: seated stationary pedaling while watching television, aquatic therapy where the water supports your entire body weight, or even a daily routine of deep, intentional stretching and focused breathing can dramatically increase cerebral blood flow. The goal is simply to remind your cardiovascular system that the brain requires a constant, vital delivery of oxygen. 5 minutes of gentle, pain-free movement performed multiple times throughout the day is infinitely more protective for your memory than an exhausting, joint-destroying hour at the gym. We must also draw inspiration from one of the most fascinating longitudinal studies in the history of neuroscience, a project known as the Nun Study. Decades ago, researchers began tracking the cognitive health of hundreds of Catholic sisters. These women lived virtually identical lifestyles, ate the same foods, and experienced the same environment. When the sisters eventually passed away, they donated their brains to the study. What the pathologists found under the microscope changed our understanding of aging forever. They discovered brains that were absolutely riddled with the devastating pathology of Alzheimer's and late. Brains that physically looked as though they belonged to someone in the final, non-verbal stages of severe dementia. Yet while they were alive, These specific sisters showed absolutely no outward symptoms of memory loss. They remained sharp, witty, and fully independent until their final breath. How is this biologically possible? The answer lies in a concept called cognitive reserve. Throughout their lives, these sisters had built an incredibly dense, complex web of neural connections through continuous learning, deep social engagement, and intellectual curiosity. They had built so many redundant bridges and pathways in their brains that when the disease slowly destroyed one path, the brain simply routed the signal through another. They had built a cognitive fortress so robust that the pathology of the disease could not penetrate their daily function. This means that you have the profound power to build your own cognitive reserve right now, today, regardless of your age. You do not need a PhD to do this. You simply need to step outside of your mental comfort zone. Your brain operates on a ruthless principle of use it or lose it. If you spend your days watching the exact same television programs, having the exact same conversations, and walking the exact same route, your brain goes on autopilot. It stops building new connections. To build reserve, you must introduce novelty. Listen to a genre of music you have never explored. Attempt to learn a few phrases of a new language. Try brushing your teeth with your non-dominant hand. These seemingly trivial, frustrating little tasks force your brain to wake up, to struggle slightly, and to lay down fresh, resilient neural pathways. Every new connection you forge is an insurance policy against the insidious progression of cognitive decline. We have established the true nature of the imposter dementia. We understand that late is driven by neuroinflammation and the misfolding of the TDP43 protein, not the amyloid plaques of Alzheimer's. We have laid out the gentle, deeply impactful protocols for putting out that inflammatory fire through targeted nutrition, structural repair with omega-3s, antioxidant protection, and the critical importance of pain-free, modified blood flow. You now possess the blueprint to begin reversing the hostile environment within your mind and coaxing your brain cells back into a state of vibrant health. However, everything we have discussed today about repairing your brain cells is completely dependent on a hidden mechanical process that occurs only while you are completely unconscious. Even if you perfectly execute the nutritional and movement protocols, your brain acts like a massive biological engine, and every engine produces toxic exhaust. If this daily exhaust is not meticulously cleared away every single night, it will physically suffocate your memory centers, rendering all of your hard work entirely useless. It turns out that there is a precise biological wash cycle in your brain, but the vast majority of seniors are unknowingly blocking this crucial system simply because of the physical angle at which they are resting their heads. If you want to discover the exact, zero-cost sleeping posture that actively flushes neurotoxins out of your skull before you wake up, you need to click the video on your screen right now, and I will show you exactly how to align your body to save your mind.